Greetings, gamers, and welcome to the 93rd live stream from the Misfit Gamer Studios. I'm your host, Vortex, and this is D&D Discussions. On today's episode, we're going to be diving into the very brief history of ritual casting. I thought this was going to be a little bit more of an expansive topic, but really, I guess ritual casting is not that old. It's very new for D&D, so that's going to be really of a short kind of deep dive. We are going to go through quite a bit of the spells that are covered in ritual casting, and I'm going to give some of my own hot takes on, my own personal beliefs on ritual casting. As you know, I really don't think that it does enough for the ability, and I really think that there could be a lot more to be said about that, but we're going to go over it as we go over these spells. So yeah, that'll be interesting. That's going to be today's topic. We were going to split today's topic up into two sections. We were going to do ritual casting, and then we were also going to do a history on the spell Simulacrum. However, with Kage not in the studio with me today, and it's going to be me running solo, I think I'm going to split this topic up and move the second topic to next week when he'll be back, because then we'll be able to really get into it. That one has a little bit more of a history, so we'll also be able to have a lot longer of a stream on that one. And I think some of the changes that were made on each of the individual additions for Simulacrum are going to be a lot more open for us to talk about and give our opinions on. So we are going to pick up that one next week. So yeah, so this week we're just going to be focusing on the history of ritual casting and the spells that it encompasses, and then just me giving some hot takes on that. So yeah, join me with that. One quick little thing, I don't know if y'all have noticed yet, but yeah, we did finally do a name update. So that's been kind of coming, more or less it's been, a long time coming, in the sense that since we started really shifting away this year, shifting away from the individual mindset and bringing Misfit Gamer Studios into more of a conglomerate of things, I guess you could say. Like, now that we're, I guess we're expanding instead of just looking at it as the Twitch account, and now that we're making more plans to do YouTube content, more plans to expand that out, and now that we have the actual Discord up and running, and that we have a couple other things on the horizon, we really felt that moving forward with a more well put together brand, more branding idea was going to be the best step. So we wanted to kind of figure out when the best time of that was going to be, but we had some conversations over the week and just realized that with something like that, with something that really wasn't in question, that we knew that we wanted to make the change to, and we knew that was going to be better for the long term in terms of getting people to be able to go from one outlet to the next. If they find us on YouTube, it's going to be a lot easier to find us on Twitch. If they find us on Twitch and want to go to the YouTube channel, it's going to be a lot easier when everything's named the same. So that's really where the mindset came from. And we just kind of had a side discussion and realized that if that is going to be the final decision, there really isn't any better time than now to just make that decision, because at that point, the sooner we make it easier for everybody to find us, and for people to be able to do a click through rate, see us on YouTube or anything like that, and then come straight to Twitch and find us. That's really more important, I think, for the next stages of growth that we're going to be going through. So yeah, we kind of finally bit the bullet on that. I realized that since I've really just taken a step back and haven't really made any dedicated efforts to do gaming content as a primary, I don't really see any need to individually brand myself through that. If I'm doing any kind of gaming on stream, it's mainly just because I want to play the game and just be available to chit chat with you guys, kind of outside of D&D, and be more of a casual opportunity to get to know me. So realistically, if you guys see that happening, and especially because I usually put it in the title, it's not really necessary that the entire page be dedicated to me anymore. And with the plans that we have for YouTube in terms of, what Misfit Gamer Studios is going to be doing, what kind of channels we're going to be running, and what kind of content we're going to be putting out, it just made a whole lot more sense to, really just take that, keep myself as just the host, one of the known hosts, and let that just be a known thing for those that know, and those that don't can find, will be able to find out. But otherwise, it's a lot easier just to, have the Twitch match the YouTube. That's really just the biggest thing, is having both of those names match, having that consistency, having the discoverability be equal across the board. and for just, future plans of branding, it just makes the most sense because we really we really just figured out that we just needed to kind of, hone in on what is going to be, the brand name, what is going to be the face of everything. And it really just always has been Misfit Gamer Studios. So yeah, that's kind of going to be what it's going to be from here on out. I'm liking the change already. I was already thinking that the MGS Live was just already too much of a big add-on, so I wasn't really interested in keeping that. And once I started really thinking about just dropping that and keeping just Vortex, it really just didn't make any sense for what we were doing in terms of the live stream and the episodes that we were doing and the content for YouTube. So, yeah, it just really made a lot more sense to do it this way. Do I kind of know how to use things like Paint or Photoshop? I have not touched Photoshop in years, and I don't think Kage has any real digital arts experience. But I will be starting this month. I'm going to be teaching myself Adobe Premiere Pro for video editing. So I will be teaching myself that. All you know is cropping. Yeah, I don't even know if I would have that ability to crop anymore these days, but we'll see. I will be training myself on some, the Adobe Premiere. So hopefully we'll be able to get some. I'm hoping that at best, within like a month or two. I would say at the end of the month, but I have no idea, honestly, how long it's going to take me to learn this stuff. So I'm hoping that, within the next month or two, I'll be able to have a couple shorts on the channel, at least our secondary channel, which is going to be our quote unquote main channel. And because right now we're just pushing everybody to the VODs channel. But eventually, we'll have our quote unquote main channel that's kind of just sitting in the background right now. And once I can get a couple shorts up and then maybe just sit down, edit one of the live stream VODs, and then get that one finally posted on the main channel. Maybe we'll start to push people over there instead. So not really sure how we're going to go that route, because one of my biggest concerns about going over to YouTube right now is consistency. I don't want to put, I don't want to practice, put 2 or 3 videos out and then make it be 6 months until my next video. I know that's not really how the landscape works, but I also know that I'm not going to be pumping out, 2 videos a week. So I'm going to have to figure out what's going to be a good line between, can I get up, how quickly can I get to to edit one video a month? That would be really nice. I don't know how long that's going to take me with my current schedule. If I could, the ultimate goal would obviously be at least 1 video a week. I don't know if I would ever be able to get to a point to where I would be able to get, both episodes, Monday, Friday episodes out in the same week edited, but we'll see how that plan goes. But right now the goal is to work up to 1 episode a month. And if I can at least get there, I might start posting on the main channel. At least that way I'll have some backlog. And then once I finally get, caught up, I'll at least have consistency of 1 video a month, because I don't really want to enter the YouTube space until I know that we can consistently pump out at least that much, because at least that way we won't get entirely buried by the algorithm. But it's still going to be an uphill battle, especially in the D&D space. So it's just one of those things until I actually get a good editor and a full-time editor, which probably won't happen for another year. YouTube is just one of those things where I just have to play it kind of careful. So we'll see how that goes. But other than that, yeah, that was like that's going to be the biggest update that we've made, is the name change. And as we move forward, like we said, we will be posting some polls once we kind of figure out some of the ideas that we have for the episode title name changes. That's going to be one of the things that we're going to be asking you guys about in the Discord, what you guys think about the new episode titles that we're going to be doing, because Homebrew Review is just, it's not really working long term. It's not unique enough. There's too many other people that use that phrasing, which makes sense, but we want to have something a little bit more specific to us, especially something that's more categorizable on YouTube, to say the least, and to where we can actually start, building out like a different following there. So look out for that. there'll be name changes for Homebrew Review and for Friday's episodes. We don't know if we're going to stick with deeper discussions or if we're going to be changing that up as well. So yeah, we're going to come up with a couple names that we like. We have a couple, or we have like one or two for each, but we want to have like an actual good list to be able to present to the community and see what the community thinks. And then hopefully once we get some feedback there, and then we do some other research, in the YouTube space, once we kind of get a popularity choice, we will figure out which one we'll nail down, and then we'll figure out how we're going to transition that branding, because it's been so long. We've been doing, Homebrew Review for 8-9 months now. So yeah, it's not going to be an easy transition, and of course, editing the old videos versus the new videos, there's going to be some oddness when the name changes. So yeah, things I got to think about as time goes on. It's stuff I want to think about, but not really stuff that I'm prepared to think about. But other than that, Kage had some family stuff, so it is just me today. I was really hoping that ritual casting was going to have a much richer history, a much deeper history, but yeah, it's funny because I realized that I hadn't had, much like when I chose to do this topic, I was kind of excited because I'm like, oh yeah, I don't really, have a ton of like accessible knowledge on ritual casting. It was one of those situations where I was like, hey, I don't immediately, know a ton about it, which probably means I haven't experienced a lot. So I was, I'm always interested in refreshing my memory and going back and pulling some old data. So I was really interested in this. And then throughout the week, as I'm poking and prodding through the books and everything, I'm realizing I'm like, oh, this really doesn't have very much of a history at all. It doesn't have a rich history, which it's kind of unfortunate. I was really hoping to, to see one of the things that I always look forward to in doing these history episodes, the history of episodes, is finding those gems of knowledge that we take for granted in terms of like changes that were made over the editions. That's why I'm always so excited to really tear it apart and see which edition did what to it, because it's always interesting to see how something was intended originally and how it's been changed over the course of its, of time, whether or not it's the players that have changed it, whether it was abandoned and then got, have then been brought back after a couple editions that we've seen before. So it's always a unique thing. And I'm always looking forward to things that I'm not familiar with, because I'm hoping to see, what kind of evolution it's gone through and which version of it I like the best. But yeah, I was slightly disappointed with ritual casting, not only because it's going to be a little bit difficult to extend this episode out, but I was just disappointed because I would have thought with D&D as a whole, and a world of fantasy and magic, and the idea of how we've talked about before, how the original D&D had taken into account a lot of real world, legends and mythos and ideas and beliefs. So it kind of struck me as really odd that with our grandiose ideas of magic and the things that people do, especially with the extent that that current modern day religions go through and current belief systems go through to represent their faiths and their beliefs, it was fascinating to me to realize that magic, while itself was a ritual of sorts in D&D, the concept of rituals being different, rituals being something else, was never really a thing. Basically, for the first several editions, the closest thing that ever really came out of it, or came close to what we would consider a ritual now, is basically spells that took a while. But it was never called out. It was never used as a term. If any of the booklets or supplements ever mentioned it, it was in passing, like a cultist ritual or something like that. But it was never about a specific spell or a specific type of spell. So yeah, I was really fascinated with this, that especially in the early stages, I was really fascinated not to see rituals being some sort of more grandiose magic. That's kind of where I've always, kind of thought it would be, is this idea of you have, your normal magic, your mortal magic, your spells, the things that, have been figured out and have been replicated and reproduced and spread. But then you have rituals, things that only take, time and effort to know and only can be taught by, secrets, like secret society kind of things. Like I always figured rituals would be spells that were above and beyond, what you could carry in a spell book kind of thing. So, almost like, again, you could have all the, the rules in the spell book, but the ability to cast it would always go far beyond just using a spell book, right? Like you always had to like do a big show for it. So that was always kind of, my interest, or at least my initial reactions to what I thought the history of rituals would look like. And again, looking back through the history of it, the very first, and this is, I'm kind of surprised, kind of upset Kage isn't here for this, but this might be a first for us. I'm almost ashamed to say this because, again, rituals feel like so second nature, so ingrained with magic, in my opinion, that I'm kind of ashamed that it took all the way until 4th edition for rituals to actually be a thing. And I'm kind of upset about that. I'm really upset that we actually, not even 3.5, but it wasn't until 4th edition that we finally see the first rituals. And instead of them, being like tied to what we know as, what you may know about rituals right now, the rituals from 4th edition were, so in 4th, I forget how this worked, because in 4th edition you had like powers, like daily type powers, and these rituals didn't affect those normal daily powers. Rituals in 4th edition were a separate set of, I guess, combat abilities, or a different set of spell-like abilities that the spellcasters were able to have. They also required their own unique spell components, and they always ended up taking a lot longer to do. So again, they 4th edition kind of did almost what I was thinking, where they set aside a certain sect of spells and abilities that they called rituals. But it wasn't this, again, it wasn't what we think of as being able to get a freebie spell. This was just a different set of spells that you were able to do. And then the rituals were somewhat combative, and then there were a lot of non-combat rituals as well. You had like divination and travel rituals. So again, these were what you would consider nowadays as standard spells, like higher level spells. I mean, you had travel spells like teleportation, divination spells, being able to, see distances or see into several rounds in the future. And then like you had message spells, communication type spells that you were able to send communication far distances. And all of these were considered rituals. So still falls short to what I would consider a proper ritual, because it seems like the very first thing we did was just, what D&D was trying to do with 4th edition is give us here's your normal combat, because D&D 4th edition was very combat oriented. So it sounded like, for me, from the information that I was able to pull and the very limited resources I have of 4th edition, it just sounded like what they were trying to do was they started using the term ritual to indicate either non-combative or more utility-like spells that can be used in a variety of different ways to help different situations. And it, again, not really combat oriented, not really about the power of the spell, but just trying to say, hey, in a very combat oriented, game, we wanted to, it sounds like they wanted to categorize a certain level of spell or a certain set of spells as non-combative, or here's the ones that you may want for other non-combat purposes, more that more utility purpose. So I don't really know what the purpose of you calling that for 4th edition, calling it ritual spells. I couldn't really figure out what the mindset there was, or what the logic was in terms of utilizing the term ritual casting or ritual spells, but they also were just called rituals. So, it was the first thing that, that they've thrown out at us using that term. I don't really know if that's really the same as a ritual spell versus, rituals, again, as in just, I don't know. Rituals is such a weird term because I guess you could take it in a couple different ways, whether that be something of greater power that takes more concentration, more focus, more time, more effort, or I guess you could just say that rituals are things of like the mundane, things that, are so passive, which is why, it wouldn't cost a spell slot. You've done it 100 times, you kind of just do it in the background and then the magical effect happens. So I guess that's kind of two different directions that you could consider rituals. I'm on the first side of things, the former side of things, where I've always looked at rituals as spells that would take more methodical effort, more time, more precision. So that's why that you have more things, more different types of materials, more actions that would have to be taken in order to accomplish it. I lean more into that camp than I do the idea that rituals would be things like what you would do on a daily basis in order to get like a boon or some kind of buff. But I could see both of those. Like I could see that being both sides of the coin in terms of looking at what rituals are. But again, not really sure entirely what fourth edition was going for. But I think that their entire goal was just to say, hey, here's a set of utility spells to keep in mind outside of battle. But yeah, that was pretty much the main history, because then we get right into 5th edition, and that's really where they refined it into what we know today. So essentially, this has now been boiled down to the ritual casting ability allows a certain type of class. So you have wizards, druids, and clerics can use the ritual casting ability if they have it, if they're granted this feat, in order to spend an additional 10 minutes of casting time. So whatever the spell's casting time is, plus 10 minutes, and essentially reserve or cast the spell and not be able to burn a spell slot, which, at its face, I absolutely understand the desire for such a spell. Or such an ability, right? A feat to be able to not burn a spell slot with a well-prepared and executed spell. I actually don't disagree with that. Now, in terms of calling that ritual casting, and in my opinion, I don't know if that was the best. Like, I think it was still a good feat. I still think the feat should have existed, and I still think they should have created it. But I guess what I'm thinking of is maybe they could have called it something different and reworked ritual casting into something completely different. But we'll get into that as we get into the spells. But I do agree with what they've done in terms of not every spell can be done like this, right? So it still has to have the ritual spell tag, which I do appreciate that they identified that there are some spells that shouldn't be able to go off like this and that they were a little bit limiting. Now, in my opinion, that's where I want to get into is whether, when we go through the different leveled spells, were they really limiting properly? I don't know if I agree with it, but we'll get into that a little bit more. The classes are wizard, clerics, druid, and occasionally you can get, I think it is a class feat that you can get, or there's certain kind of feats that you can get that will grant you the ritual casting feat that if you're not a wizard, cleric, or a druid. And then, as mentioned before, it's a 10-minute add-on to the normal spells casting time. Now, while I appreciate the balance of making it, I mean, realistically, I can understand why they chose 10 minutes, because doing something like an hour wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense, narratively or roleplay wise. But at the same time, in my personal opinion, I don't know if just adding 10 minutes to the casting time is is really a good representation of it, mainly because I've not seen a lot of. I know. I guess I understand that the balance is it's trying to not make it combat available, and you're supposed to do it outside or way before combat. But for me, there's so many games that I've seen that don't. So many games that I've seen play that don't really utilize time like that, to where for someone to do a ritual essentially is a free spell. You know, when all that's added is 10 minutes, I guess what I'm saying is like there's so many games that I've been a part of that in essence it's a free spell because 10 minutes isn't really it's not really represented, like what happens in that 10 minutes, or whether or not the party actually recognizes that they've lost that 10 minutes versus recognizing the ability that they got from letting the caster do that. That's one of those things where, because it's only an extra 10 minutes plus the spell's casting time, if you have a handful of 24-hour spells that and the party doesn't care that you spend an hour or two before you guys leave on a long travel or whatever, to do all of this stuff, it kind of is a little bit much in my opinion, and I've seen it kind of abused that way. So I don't really have. I've been trying to work on a fix for that, but I think it's also just in general what they're trying to accomplish in terms of like being allowing players to prep before an encounter and prep before a challenge or a travel. I get what they're trying to do, and I don't disagree with it, but again, I don't know if just adding 10 minutes really makes it worthwhile as an extra challenge. I don't know if adding 10 minutes really makes it a different decision. Now, I also believe that it does lower the spell's casting ability, right? If I remember correctly, so the casting time is extra 10 minutes. No spell slot is used. And then for wizards, it has to be in their spell book. For druids and clerics, it has to be prepared. But I thought something was where it isn't with ritual casting. Doesn't it cast at the lowest? Let me see here. So certain spells have spell casting, or the spell can be cast as a ritual. Cast it doesn't, which means. Okay, so because it doesn't cost a spell slot, it can't be cast at a higher level. So you can't upcast a ritual, which I think is good. And then to cast a spell as a ritual, spellcaster must have the feature that grants the ability to do so. Cleric, druid, for example, have such a feature. Must also have the spell prepared or on its list. And this character. Yeah. So. Okay, so I thought I had read something where it casts it at like the lowest level, but I guess that's what it's trying to say right here, is that it's because it doesn't burn a spell slot, you can't upcast it. So I guess that's what I maybe interpreted that as, is it has to be cast at its lowest level. Big Dungeon Energy, what is going on? Angry Meatball, how you doing? Sounds like maybe the issues with implemented rituals, but the time in general in the system. That is definitely, I agree with you, one of my issues, and we've talked about this on a couple other episodes, but yeah, I'm not a huge fan of how a lot of people have represented time in the game, but we'll get into a little bit more about just like why I think of rituals differently, because I look at rituals, again, as more of a concentrated effort of magic, so I feel, generally speaking, that rituals, in the sense of what 5th edition does, where they just basically give you the ability to cast certain spells without burning a spell slot. I think really where the division comes down for me is what I would really like to see is that rituals are essentially their own separate section of magic. Now, I don't, in the sense of like, I would like to see ritual only spells, like more ritual only spells, and less common spells that can be cast as rituals. I think that's the balance that in the end I'll end up getting to. But that's really like I think always what I've looked at in terms of ritual casting is like a different level of magic, right? Because you have magic that has verbal, somatical, components, things that you have to be like precise about. But I've always looked at rituals, think about like what we call rituals in the real world. They're pageantries almost, right? They're scripts. There's things that you would have to memorize to say, certain ways that you have to walk, certain items that you would have to be placed in certain locations, not just, a piece of mica that you have to hold or burn a piece of incense, but the idea that, you would have to set up candles in a certain position and then draw chalk in a certain way and then recite certain things. These are the things that I think about when I think of like a ritual. Is a spell is something compact. It's something that I can do all in and of itself, all, in and of the moment. But for me, a ritual is something that has to be prepared for, has to be laid out and done. And it's a much more concerted effort. So when I think of doing a ritual, I think of something much more powerful. So the idea that rituals really in 5th edition are just regular spells that can be cast, in my opinion, for free, because I usually don't see people utilize the aspect of time very much, or again, if it just well timed out, the passage of time isn't really enough of a deterrence to not use rituals a lot, in my opinion, which is why I really would like to see a lot more power come from rituals. So I guess, really thinking about it, I would like to really see rituals be their own subsect of spells, and then only have a select few standard spells be able to be cast as rituals, if that makes a little bit more sense to what we're talking about here. 10 minutes is too cheap a cost because it isn't worth anything in your experience. That's really what I'm saying. But the idea is that they only should cost time, which in theory is a limited resource. Time typically is a limited resource. When it comes to, like, especially in game or at least player agency, especially if they're trying to prepare right before. Because I mean, again, I look at it in terms of the 24-hour spells is the ones that I feel like aren't really like costing you much. Now you have something like Detect Magic, which is only a 10-minute lasting spell. So to wait 11 minutes to have a spell that will only last 10 minutes, that's a much different deal, because then you have to prepare a lot more in advance for that one. Whereas being able to wake up, cast a spell before you guys, leave camp, and then you have that 24-hour magic, that's kind of where I look at in terms of, I don't see a 10-minute add-on being a huge detriment to, what you get from from what you get on the tail end of that. Have you made many players perform a ritual that way with the candles chalk? So in terms of that, now in terms of rituals, that's just when I think of the terms, right? When I think of the idea of ritual casting, my mind just, real world immediately goes to something of a pageantry, right? Something that's going to take multiple steps that you're going to have to prepare before you can begin, right? Draw everything out, place everything. That's just kind of where I go when I think of, hey, what would I think of as ritual? Because when I think of D&D magic, I think of it a little bit more quick paced, right? Short quips, hand gestures, and quick uses of small pieces of material. So when approached with the idea of ritual casting, right? When I first, before I went into the history of it this week and looked at all the history of it, I was expecting a little bit more of that, right? I was expecting more of rituals to be representative of a higher class of magic or a higher tier of magic. Since I don't typically run my own 5e games, I have not run into gaming with rituals because it's not a 2e mechanic. Rituals weren't really there until 4th edition. So I haven't really run into anybody with that. But when it comes to custom magic in my realm, when I have run into people wanting to do things that really aren't by the book in a sense, when they've wanted to do something kind of like a one-off that is magical, that kind of fits whatever their character build is, but there wasn't really a spell to get it off or to figure it out, I have allowed for these kind of moments where what I would call a ritual cast, where they were able to explain how they were going to basically accomplish it with different wait, I think that one of them was like they wanted to find somebody, and they basically kind of put together a personalized ritual to locate them. So it was basically like a location spell, kind of similar to what you would find in the Dresden Files series, where they made a device and then did a ritual essentially with articles of, I think, clothing and one of the weapons from the other party members. Did that, and then they were able to imbue another object. I forget what the object was that they created, but they imbued an object to basically be a compass. And that was the idea. Is they had this idea of, I think they took blood from a wolf to imbue it. So it was like, instead of a compass in water, it was like in blood, but it was like a feather of something and the blood of a wolf because it sniffed them out, kind of concept. It was really cool. I let it go because I thought it was a dope idea. But yeah, that was just my own personal thing. So I haven't really, like, that was like the only example of that, but I don't necessarily say that I change up how rituals work. It's just that when I think of rituals, I don't think of just being able to get a spell off just because you spent a little bit longer on it. I feel like that doesn't do the idea. And then again, personal semantics here, but I just don't feel like it really represents what what I think a ritual could be. So I think that it's just not doing it justice. I think that what 5th edition does with ritual casting, the feature that it gives wizards to be able to do that, I think is necessary. I think it's a great ability. I just think that I think I would like to see more from the idea of rituals and ritual casting. Big Dungeon Energy, you love Dresden? Well, yeah, I'm glad you do. A big part of High Point comes from that. I always like to say that the main pillars or the main influences outside of D&D are Dresden, Doctor Who, and Supernatural. So I have a lot of the way that I run my magic in High Point is based off of the fundamentals of the Dresden series, as well as how I run the Fey Realm as well. The entire Fey Realm and the idea of the overlapping planes a lot derives from that, and then Forgotten Realms. It's basically a blend of Dresden Files and Forgotten Realms. All 3 of those, nice. We'll have to sit down one of these days and chat about all of the different ones. I did do a 5-point episode series on the origins of High Point, and went through all of like the different influences and all of that. So if you're ever interested, I talk about a lot about like where all of those influences come in from. But yeah, so again, I really do like what ritual casting does in 5th edition. I was just really surprised that there wasn't a bigger history with it, and I really was hoping that it would be more powerful. I was just kind of hoping that it would give a little bit more oomph to things. But it's just, it's not doing anything bad. I don't think I would get rid of it. I just think I would add to it, in my opinion. It doesn't live to its narrative function. When you see or hear rituals, you're thinking, Vecna Lives, where you're getting someone sitting around you until they know what an item does. Yeah, exactly. And that's the idea. Is like, to me, when you tell me ritual, when I just hear that word, I feel like that already gives me a narrative that I want to lean into. I want to get into this idea. When I think of ritual, I think of like, if you're doing a BBEG, if you're going to go after the BBEG, and like the idea is you have a time frame because you need to stop the ritual. That ritual isn't lasting, 1 round, right? That ritual should be like 10 rounds or 10 turns. That ritual is going to last a while. It's it's the chanting. I mean, we even saw this in Baldur's Gate, right? Like in the very early stages of Baldur's Gate in the Druid thing, they were doing that chant that was providing the shield. To me, that's a ritual, right? Having multiple mages create a shield, and if you have to take down multiple mages to take the shield down, like what they're doing to me is like the power of a ritual. And that's kind of what I always envisioned I would see when I did this, is like that's what I thought I'd be seeing. And then when it was just this whole idea of, hey, you don't have to burn a spell slot if you spend an extra couple minutes, and it's like, oh, that's useful. That's super useful. I'm not upset that they have that. But that's it. It's just regular spells. It's like the same old regular spells that I can normally do. I can plan them ahead of time. Like, that's cool. But I don't know. And personally, I don't know if it makes a lot of narrative sense to say that, like, because I always look at like spell slots, right? It's always hard to represent magic because it's a concept of pools of energy, like how much energy you're able to wield, but it's also like a fatigue aspect, right? Like how much energy do you have? Not just mana energy, but physically and mentally, how much energy do you have? How much can you remember to do? How precise can you be? So it's always been hard to represent that. And I look at, spell slots as that, right? They're representatives of chunks of energy that it took to do something. But that's basically just saying that if I, spent longer, is the narrative that because I spent longer and didn't try to do it fast, I didn't spend enough energy, or I didn't spend as much energy. But then you would think if I did something for 10 minutes, wouldn't that cost me more energy? Like to do it for 10 minutes. So those are the things that I try to piece together when I think of like how it operates right now. Is why is taking 10 minutes not burning the spell slot, like whatever we think of as the spell slot, right? Whatever it's mental capacity, whether it's a pool of energy, of mana or whatever, or whether it's like your physical exhaustion. I'm just trying to understand, what does doing it over the course of 10 minutes do to undo that effect, and why these spells? Because that was the other thing that I really couldn't find is a good explanation of why they chose which spells, which is why I want to go through several of the spells through the levels, is to figure out exactly what type of spells they chose and do they narratively make sense for being able to take an extra amount of time. Also have some Lord of the Rings inspiration. That's awesome. In theory, that's what you're doing, isn't it? In those 10 minutes, you're chanting, waving your arms. I mean, but again, and that's another thing too, is if that's the case, right? If I'm doing that in 10 minutes, what's interesting is, wouldn't I be casting a different spell? Because if I'm literally, if it's going to take me 10 minutes to cast it, am I just casting it very, very, very slowly? Or am I casting a whole new and different spell? And if I'm casting a whole new and different spell, again, going back to that, my original point, I would narratively like to think that I'm going to wind up with more power, like a more powerful spell, and still not burn the spell slot. So yeah, it's a very interesting narrative to kind of walk through for me, like a mental gymnastic for me when I think about that. Totem Barbarian casts Spirit Walker as a ritual, and it narrative was really fun. She sat in a forest, dug her fingers into the grass, and leaned against a tree, focused on the spirit of the forest. See, I like it. Yeah, I don't mind that, especially when you can really build that narrative when the player can build the narrative into their character. I'm totally down for that as well. Which, I mean, again, if you're playing, if time is being appropriately accounted for, I think that it could still work. I just don't know overall, like if I'm trying to play like a wizard, I'm trying to wonder like what balance is this in terms of, am I really sacrificing a lot in order to get the benefits of the spell without casting a spell slot, right? Because again, depending upon how it is, and because there's really no limit to it, depending upon how long the DM would let me say before we, packed up camp and before we left camp, I definitely would probably look into like min-maxing every morning. How many rituals could I get off, in that hour that we have before we pack up camp, right? If he gives me an hour and I can get a bunch of, 1 minute rituals off, those are, 11 minutes each. I can get at least 4 of those off. So I think that's just where I try to look at is what really is the idea behind it, right? Like what's the sacrifice I'm giving? Because I also look at, if the idea is to give me a spell for free, wouldn't I have a bigger sacrifice than just 10 minutes of my time? Because I'm getting a bigger boon in my opinion. Like as long as I have time to spare, I'm not losing anything. So, and maybe that's just it. Maybe I don't have, because the way that I work time, even as a DM, I don't know if, unless narratively my players were in a time crunch, I don't know how when I play with like time passage, there's not that much of a difference, right? Like unless my players have put themselves in a situation where they need to be somewhere at a certain amount of time and every moment counts, there's not going to be a huge detriment to them. If I were using this directly, I don't think there would be a huge detriment to them. doing this even periodically, like throughout the day or just whenever they had downtime. So that's where I would be a little bit more worried with it. But again, that's my experience with utilizing time in game as a DM and as a player. So that is also going to be a drastic game changer if time is much more of a value, right? If you have a gaming session where time is a lot more strict, or is at least calculated a lot more strictly, those minutes may actually add up against your favor. Might not be described by that same implication. So to me, spell slot versus ritual is the difference between using an application and doing something by hand. If I had electricity on hand, I'll use a stand mixer, but if not, a spatula and elbow grease works well, just takes longer. Right, but wouldn't you say that like uses up more like effort? Because again, I think like the spell slot is like the effort, but I guess that's also really hard to represent. Again, I think that's been one of D&D's like hardest problems, which is why I ended up creating like 9 different magic classes, just because I've said this for a long time. I just don't think that D&D's ever really been able to nail a good magical mechanic just yet, but it's not necessarily any fault to them. A tabletop magic mechanic, I think, is extremely difficult to represent when you're trying to balance the difference between what's happening to the player, like the character physically and mentally, as well as what's happening on a magical scale, as well as balancing what type of limitations, like how often that can happen, right? Whether it's, I mean, that's why one of the reasons why I like second edition in terms of how they represent magic, right? The idea of spell memorization, in my opinion, made more sense. It just wasn't complete. I like spell memorization more than spell slots, simply because it had a more tangible understanding, something that I could roll with in terms of what made sense for capability, right? The expansion of that capability. But it wasn't complete, which is where, using that basis, I was able to create, all of my high point variations of the mage classes, because each one of those I built off of the same progression and the same limitations that I found in second edition with memorization, right? That idea that I liked memorization because for me it represented what a real person's like growth would be representative of if you tried. So if you guys don't know, for second edition, wizards had memorization. So the idea was that you had to get better at being able to memorize the more complicated spells, aka higher spell levels. And that was also represented because it was also implied, or at least in some of the lore, it was looked at that the higher the spell level, the more complicated, as well as the more pages, the longer the spell would be, which is why it was harder to memorize, because it wasn't just a page for page, right? Level 2 could have 2 or 3 pages of memorization instead of just 1. So the idea of going up in level was not just getting better at manipulating magic, but it was also kind of like how you would go, how you would do like, maths in school, where you would go up periodically, and once you were able to retain enough information in one subject, you were able to go on to a more complicated subject, which used everything that you had learned already, but there would be a lot more to memorize and a lot more to study. And so that's kind of that was one way I was able to get behind the progression of at least wizard magic in second edition, because it made sense from a real world perspective of why those spells were inaccessible to lower magic, right? It was a combination of complicatedness and complexity, as well as length and ability to memorize that much. And so those kind of limitations is where I took that foundation and made my other classes that I felt expanded in the areas of magic that I feel the wizards just didn't really touch, because memorization was nice and good for a certain type of wizard, for a very methodical wizard, one that looked at it almost like a science, right? Like a chemistry. Everything had its piece, and every piece could be manipulated as long as you knew how they were, how they interacted with each other. But that doesn't represent how, say, natural mages work, people who just naturally in tune with magic. And that also doesn't, go for people who, come across and are imbued with magic later down the road, right? Like there's a bunch of different ways that I looked at how magic could be done, right? Like how do you interact with nature's magic, right? Because nature is, in high point, like a fundamental force, and it kind of ebbs and flows with itself. So being able to memorize these spells and these formulas, just like, the idea of memorizing this mathematical formulas isn't going to help you with biology. It is kind of like the mindset, the druids would have to go and commune with nature. It's much more of an actual communication and a dialogue with nature. And that's where I wanted it to be better represented. So that's where I went and built all of my versions. But watching how Magic has gone through all of the editions, I feel like that's just always been a struggle. It's a struggle for me, and I think it's just a struggle for anybody, is properly representing what you think Magic is and what it does is so hard to do in a, I don't want to say a cookie cutter, but in a singular fashion that can be represented, to a lot of people easily, in a lot of different situations, right? Which is why I think that it did make sense to go to spell slots, because it was one of the easiest methods to do. We recently, Kaga and I recently did our series on the Psionicist, second edition Psionicist. And what's really interesting is, like, after having gone through that, I realized that the Psionicist class was like the first and only time D&D attempted to do a mana pool. Like basically, I think it was like their, and I want to say that's probably what they ended up, what they were trying to do is test that, because you have, your pool of PSP, and every power costs a certain amount of PSP, both to initiate it and to maintain it, right? Which is exactly like a mana pool. And I've always wondered why, like it didn't really kick off, but I think looking at how the additions from third to fifth have progressed, it's probably because, just like with everything else, they really went away from the hardcore, like, pen to paper math, and wanted to get into these more streamlined aspects of, how do people pick this up and how do people pay attention, without having to, spend 10, 15 minutes every single time they take an action. And fair point, it was good. I don't think the mana pool or the PSP would have been the proper way to go with all Magic, but I did find that interesting going through that history, or going through the whole the whole Psionicist book, is that's really the only time D&D really did like a pool of mana and points for spells. And I really would be interested to see how that would have worked for a spell. But yeah, I don't think it would have been widely acceptable, because it just would have been a lot more math than I think people were willing to do. Especially because then you have to ask yourself, like, how do you deal with upcasting, and then you just do double the cost and all of that. So I think, yeah, I understand why they went to the spell slots, but I think second edition had it closest with memorization, because at least it made more sense in terms of progression and why you were learning different spells and things like that. But again, it's just one of those things that we always talk about here, is it really comes down to the DM's interpretation of things and how things work mechanically, right? Some people just look at it as magic is magic, so therefore it can do whatever you want it to do. And then there are people like Kage and I who, yes, magic is magic. It does break the ideas and laws of physics, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't follow its own guidelines and rules. And that's just kind of where we're at in terms of, of approaching things. I just realized, by the way, I have my Discord open. I just realized that I have a game open. I didn't even realize that I had my game open. That's hilarious. Apparently in Discord I've been playing Hitman this whole time. Anyway, but yeah, so that's kind of where I was at with ritual casting. Again, I think it's a good feat. I think this feat is beneficial. I don't know if I'm comfortable with the idea that it's just for known and current spells. I really would have liked to see spells that were only rituals. And I was really trying to come up with some ideas, but like when I think about what we were what I was talking about before is like I would like to see almost a different variety of spells or a different because they've played around with a bunch of different like spell classes or schools of magic, but I feel like rituals could open up a whole new idea of what magic could do for the game. And I don't want to say like meta magic in the sense of changing like like core aspects of the game, but being able to add spells that would, I guess, like have longer lasting effects. I guess like a good ritual to me. Like I think like if we wanted to kind of give it a different thing, like imagine having a set of skills where you could do rituals where they were more like buff related spells, like full party buff related spells. I think that could be a whole unique category of just like defensive or offensive related buffs that would be within that category. Things that wouldn't, again, a whole category of spells that aren't ever really intended to be done in battle, so they're kind of almost locked away from ever being used without foresight. So a category of spells that you need to be able to think ahead of time and cast before you can before you want to go do whatever actions you want to do. I would also like to see just slightly more powerful spells, instead of them just being higher level, kind of also being restricted to rituals. That way you could add some more narrative features to it. Things that would take, like a day or longer could be really interesting narratively. I think of, I go back to things like Dresden, and, one ritual I would like a custom ritual, or not custom, but like an individualized ritual I would like to see. Cause we see like curses and everything. They have a curse spell, but I would like to see like a ritual curse, that you could do, right? Like an elemental type curse, or an elemental type, or just a almost like an elemental type thaumaturgy spell that would be a ritual, where it would take like 10 hours or something like that for your character to be able to pull off. But similar to kind of like the druids, like Gale Force Wind or something, being able to do that ritual and then being able to like change the weather for up to a couple days in a whole region, or I was even thinking of other types of rituals where you think of in animes, where instead of just summoning a creature, but like ripping an entire like ripping two or ripping a hole between two different dimensions, and having almost like a boss or a god level like creature come out, right? That would be, in my opinion, something that you would want to see like on this ritual spell list, something that's just above and beyond what you would expect from your standard spells you would see someone cast in the heat of the moment. Because even 9th level spells are kind of in the heat of the moment, right? Like most spells don't take very long to cast. And that's why I would think like ritual spells that have that amount of time kind of deserve to really go above and beyond on what they can do. But that's why there's that idea that they would take so long to cast. And part of that taking long to cast, I like the idea that they have some sort of indicator, right? Like you think about that in again in anime or whatever, when they're doing the ritual, there's the dark cloud in the sky that swirls around them while they're doing it, or there's something that like the artifact that they're doing it with glows and a beacon of light can be seen for miles. Like this idea that it calls attention to you while you're doing it, but the idea is that the outcome is hopefully as good as that risk. And it would require, especially if it's a very powerful spell that people would want to stop you from doing, the idea that you would have to not only prep to do the spell, but then prep to be protected while you do the spell. It could also lead to a lot more interesting narrative functions to, that whole prepped and build up before you do the spell of, who's going to be there, who's going to watch, who might actually come and try to stop you, kind of thing. And I think that's what, we want to see in the same way. If you flip the script, that's the narrative we want to see from the BBG, right? The party would want to be the heroes that stop them from doing it. Midway through their enchantment, or, they're trying to get the entire town to do something, or they're going to sacrifice a whole bunch of people. Like, you want to have that hero come in and stop them with that time frame of, we got to get there, we got to make sure that it doesn't happen by sundown or whatever. And, if that's a narrative that we want to build for like the party to be able to do, that's like the hero's adventure mindset. I think that also could apply to the party, right? They could have a ritual that, imagine a ritual that could destroy any magical item. Like, that's the ritual. It takes 12 hours to cast, or, 24 hours to cast or something. But the ritual is that it can destroy any magical item or render any magical item inert. Like, that's the ritual. So it's like the ultimate dispel magic, right? So no matter what it is, it's the ultimate dispel magic. And that could be a huge narrative plot where, you get the item, you have to take it somewhere special in order to do this ritual. And then that's your countdown. While you're getting that ritual done, you have to, you have to protect the situation. So I think those are the kind of things that when I think of like what a ritual caster is, or what a ritual could do, those are the things that I would like to see instead of just your standard spells, right? Like, I see the benefits when I've looked at these, but I just feel like being their own category of spell is not doing it justice when you really could be adding way more interesting things to that list, in my opinion. So looking at the spells that, here, I probably won't go through every single one, but I do kind of want to at least go through different ones on the list, right? Because as I was looking at these, there are a couple here that strike me as things that make absolute sense. Ones that I look at and go, okay, this is why I agree with it. So we have something like Alarm. Normally a cast of 1 minute, duration for 8 hours. So I absolutely understand that this is fantastic, especially right before, right before the party wants to go to sleep. You can cast Alarm and, won't cost a spell slot. So even if, at the end of the long day, you don't have any spell slots, but you want to, make sure that you don't get ambushed, right? That is a perfect excuse right there, because it's going to cost you 11 minutes to cast. So when you're at the end of the day, like 10 minutes is not going to cost you anything, right? So 11 minutes, you've cast it. Now you have an 8 hours Alarm that could basically be utilized to where no one has to do watch. You can get a full night's rest. Like, those are one of those things where I'm like, okay, I either don't have spells or I'm about to go to sleep anyway, which, again, if I have a spell, I might as well just cast it. But if I don't have any spell slots right before bed, and that's why I'm doing my long rest to get my spells back, I get why you would want to do that, right? That makes sense, because it's one of those things where, you could make the argument of, it's a low level spell, done it a lot. But this is where I also start to get in the problem of like the justification, right? Like, what's the justification for being able to, to cast it without that spell slot? Because the spell slot is definitely meant to represent some sort of capability, right? Whether that's the amount of energy you can hold, the amount of energy that you can wield and manipulate. For me, it's just, I like to understand what's behind it. And the idea of just taking longer is just one of those, what is it about taking longer that, takes less out of you? And it could just be that. It could just be that it's, it's less stressful on the body to take longer to do it, right? But the idea of being able to take longer just to not burn a spell slot, it seems that, again, I just feel like there's more that could be had there, whether or not it's like, even if you could do something along the lines where during a ritual cast, you could either spend the extra time to cast it and, not burn the spell slot and you get the spell as is. Or it would be nice to also do a ritual where you can still burn the spell you can still burn like your spell slot, but then but by casting it as a ritual, you can also maybe like double the spell's amount of time. Like something like that is kind of what I'm looking for. Is again, I would like to see more than just a free spell slot for the actual effort. And that's why I think that, having some ritual only spells, I think could really make them stand out a little bit more, because some of these I don't think necessarily make a lot of sense. Like personally, I don't know if I agree that detect magic like really makes sense here. I mean, to spend 11 minutes to get a 10-minute spell, it's a weird situation to have 10 minutes to burn before you're going to have to like search. I mean, again, works good if it's like at the beginning of a dungeon, but 10 minutes also isn't a long time. So to burn 10 minutes just for 10 minutes, it's like, was saving that spell, that first level spell slot really worth it? Those are one of those questions where I'm just like, the ritual of detect magic, I think like when I think of like, what would I like to see from detect magic as a ritual? Like when I think of like, it being more grandiose, I'd almost like to see it to where something along the lines of you cast, if you do a ritual of detect magic, like it almost extends the time for like maybe up to an hour, but then it's only within things of like within like 5 feet of you or things that you touch, something along the lines of like that, something a little bit more powerful and a little bit more targeted that boosts the ability. It's kind of what I think of, when I'm looking at like what would detect magic spell do versus detect magic ritual, right? I feel like the ritual would work and act differently than just a free version of the spell. Very situational. Like again, another one, I think I opened up this one earlier, ceremony, right? Ceremony is a unique one, because it normally takes 1 hour. So this is an hour plus 10 minutes, which is interesting. And then it's giving you one of these things. Now, what's interesting about this is like, this is one of those ones where, anything that lasts like for 24 hours or 8 hours or, a decent amount of time, the ritual benefit makes the most sense, right? Because you're burning 10 minutes to basically guarantee that you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff in the future, for the next, for the next time frame, right? And I think that this is a better representation of what I would like to see a ritual spell do. Because again, you're already having a casting time of 1 hour, so. And then all of these different types of benefits, right? Like this spell in general seems to I mean, is so far like the first one that I found that really looks more or less like what I would expect just a ritual to do, right? Like a standalone ritual instead of just another spell that I can do. So this could be another example of what I would like to see is be a ritual only spell. Not just because of how long it goes, but in particular, just the abilities that you can do. Like essentially, give them, permanent, well, not permanent, but for the next 24 hours, whenever they make a saving throw, you can add a D4 to the number. So it's kind of like giving them like bardic inspiration on saving throws. Being able to bless water. Yeah, you can't become undead. Like these are kind of the effects that I would have expected to see, in what I would think is a ritual. Identify, right? Like identify, it casts 1 minute. Now see, okay, so this is where one of those ones where it's like, okay, is there a situation where I really, really need to cast this, but I really don't want to burn the spell slot? Like, I can understand. Identify is one of those ones where it's like, do I really want to burn a spell slot? But having it as a ritual, like in this case, when I read that Identify is a ritual spell, I read this as too many people complained that they don't want to burn a spell slot for a basic spell like Identify. So now it can be a ritual just so I can say I burned an extra 10 minutes and I didn't burn it, right? Like it's almost like this was on there just to kind of appease the idea that no one wants to actually burn a spell slot to use this ability. I don't really see why there's any justification to why this would be like being able to be ritualized, right? And again, you know, looking at like the difference between these, you know, Find Familiar, again, kind of makes sense. I mean, you know, again, it is one that normally takes an hour to cast anyway, but I can understand that one being a ritual, because that one is also it's a larger effect, right? You're not really going to cast that one. Like, it doesn't make much sense to force a player to, you know, burn a spell slot for something that they're only going to do once in a long blue moon, right? That's one of those things where it's like Find Familiar could be a ritual only spell. Because it's not really something that you're going to be casting a lot of the time. So the idea that it even burns a spell slot doesn't make a whole lot of sense when a ritual, me going out into the forest for an hour and doing this thing, isn't going to affect what I can do later in the fight. So, and maybe that's where I would say my logic lies, is it's not so much the casting time, but maybe it's like the intent and purpose, right? So it's like Find Familiar isn't really something that I'm going to be doing, you know, a lot of. Like, I'm not going to be trying to do this multiple times in a day. And its effect is a lot more long lasting and further reaching than just like what I would expect to happen in an encounter, or, you know, not necessarily in combat, but just in, you know, encountering people, right? So maybe that's where I would draw the line, is it's the extent of the spell as well as how much it actually affects, not just how long it would actually take. Illusionary Script. I mean, I again, one of those ones where it's like, was it really necessary to I mean, were people just mad that it was a spell and they were burning a spell slot for that? Like, I don't really know if that's one that I really think, you know, is necessary for that. Like Unseen Servant, I'm not really sure Unseen Servant deserves to be a ritual. Even though it lasts for an hour, I just, you know, it's... I guess I'm just having a hard time understanding, like, what's the... Excuse me. You know, what's the justification for, again, saying I'm spending an extra 10 minutes, I'm getting this more time, you know, I'm getting more of this. I think that any spell that has a much more longer lasting and longer ranging effects, I think, make more sense to be rituals. Beast Sense, Gentle Repose, you know, locate animal or plants, things like that, I can understand being rituals, because it's like you take the time to send your senses out and see if you can, you know, sense or feel what's going on. I can absolutely understand that as a ritual type spell. You know, Magic Mouth, I don't think it really makes sense. Silence, I don't know if that really makes sense for a ritual. Trying to think, does it really... And again, it's a concentration up to 10 minutes, so it's like you spend 10 minutes of your time just to concentrate for another 10 minutes. I'm not really understanding why doing all of that just to not burn a spell slot. Like, yeah, I would really like to see rituals be just their own type of spell category. Because, you know, it would make sense that, you know, not everybody can cast these types of spells. So having the different, you know, class limitations would still make sense. And having some of these spells, right? Having some spells that can be cast as rituals to gain the benefit of not burning a spell slot, I think is a good idea. But I think it just falls short in highlighting what the idea of a well planned out, well methodical, you know, spell would look like. Because, I mean, a ritual is really just a grandiose type of spell, in my opinion. Can agree with that. Rituals being their own. Yeah, I feel like when I think of like if I'm gonna take the time and effort to do all of these things, I really think that the reward, and I don't mean the reward should be, I don't want to see ritual spells just be an extension of normal spells, right? I don't want to see just more powerful versions of the standard spells as rituals. What I want to see is that they're their own kind of thing. Like, divination and clairvoyant spells, I think, could be fantastic ritual-based spells, right? If you're going to, it's one thing to do a small spell to send a message to somebody but like contacting, like how warlocks get their patrons, right? Contacting a deity of that power across dimensions, that whole process should be a ritual. To do that, to actually reach through the veil of different dimensions and contact a being like that, should be a ritual, right? And that maybe there's like a ritual warlocks can have, where it's like, it could be like, like pact contact or whatever, where it's a ritual that only warlocks can do, and it's literally the way they contact their patron, right? Or patron contact or whatever. It's like those are the kind of things that I imagine are going on, right? Like, there's so many ways that druids, I think, could be much more interesting. Like, Kalgai and I have talked about this before, where, imagine a druid having a ritual, called like, create grove or something, where if they spend, 12 hours not moving in a location, they can turn like a 30 by 30 zone into a habitable space for them. So whatever the vegetation is, it turns into vegetation for that druid. So it can feed them. It will somehow, provide like an area of drinkable water to a survivable extent, maybe not luxury. It'll provide them with like a base shelter out of like whatever's there. So either vines will turn into like a makeshift canopy, or a giant tree will rot out into like a small little studio. Like, I imagine like that's a ritual I want a druid to have, where they can go somewhere and affect the land around them, and the end result is exactly what you expect a druid to have. It is a natural growth that they've basically taken an area, let it overgrow, but that overgrowth also turns into something that they can use. And then when they leave, kind of like, again, the ritual will last for like 10 days, and then at the end of the 10 days, it will be reclaimed by nature, fully, and basically no sign that they lived there will be there anymore, right? Like stuff like that, I imagine, clerics, being able to what is it? Don't they have a spell that can like bless like desecrated ground or something, where, like they can get rid of like corrupted ground or stuff? Like, that's a ritual, in my opinion. Being able to, like, again, think about narratively, where you have a bunch of like undead issues in a town or something, and you finally have a cleric be able to do a ritual at the cemetery that blesses everything and gets rid of all of the undead and all of the ghosts, and that's just how you solve the thing. But they have to figure out, what are the key components of that ritual? Where do they go get all the pieces? How do they interpret how it works? Like spells could be so much more than just a thing your character could do. Imagine if rituals were those things, right? Imagine a ritual like it wasn't just a material component of, oh, you just need this. Imagine if like the idea of the material components were semi-rare, or they were intended to be like plot points for the DMs to use, right? Like side quests and things to sprinkle in. So it wasn't just yes, that spell, now you can do XYZ, but or just, hey, you have to wait till you have enough gold, because there are some spells that are like, you need, a 5,000 GP gem. And it's like, but this would be more than that, right? This would be, I really want to be able to do that spell, but that means I actually have to like detour from the campaign, or go and adventure, or I have to go and do something to earn this ritual, instead of it just being another spell I get for free. And that's kind of where I think I think that's just where it's best for me to just explain my mindset of it, is when I hear ritual on a personal basis, I think of more grandiose activity. And when I think of that, I think of just what would that mean, right? Like, big nudge energy. Here's a good one for you. So like, you think about supernatural, right? Like, there's a big difference, in my opinion, between like a spell, which would be the depossession chant, right? So they know that they know all the chants, and they've memorized the depossession chant. So they can spew out in a matter of like 90 seconds. They can practically, exorcise a demon from anybody in like 90 seconds. They can just spout their Latin and the demon's out of the body. Exercise. Exercise. However, the difference between doing that and then banishing them to hell, you know what I mean? When they have to actually trap them in the pentagram, on the ground, in the chair, they have to do they're sitting there, they're walking around them, they're hitting them with holy water, they're doing the chant, and then they actually do the whole thing where it rips open the hole and then the demon goes back to hell. That is a ritual, right? And that's what I'm thinking of in D&D is like, basically D&D is saying is, oh yeah, that chant, you can just do it longer. And it's free. It's like, that's not what I think of. I think of that idea of, if I want that, if I want, like, turn undead would be a spell, but like you have raise undead, so drop undead. Like, it's one thing to like turn the undead, meaning like have them, run away from you. That would be a spell, but to like decouple that necrotic energy from the body so it stops being undead would be a ritual, something like that. Like, that's what I want to see, and that's what I think what I try to represent in terms of what I call like custom spells. When my players want to do something that's just not the standard, I always let them know that things like that usually aren't repeatable, but those are those moments where I'm like, hey, if you can make it make sense, if we can work on something that leads to that outcome, I'm okay with it. But make it work. Make them work for it. Make it worth it. And that's where I think we could get with rituals. I think that rituals deserve to be a highlight. They deserve to be these. It's not just a 9th level spell, right? It's not just an extra wish spell. I want these things to be both game changing, but I want them to be game inducing. And by that, I mean, I don't want them to just be these high level spells, but I want them to be high level spells that can be game changing, right? That can truly be something like a ritual that lets you talk to any deity. Like just a ritual that if you can pull it off and you just tell the DM, I'm talking to this deity, you just do it. You just boom, direct line to that deity, whether it pisses them off or not. You know what I mean? Like being able to, like a true teleport spell, like teleport anywhere, even if you don't know where you're going. Imagine a ritual that you can teleport to your like actual intent. So if you truly want to just say, I want to go to the BBEG, I want to be in front of him right now, the spell will take you there regardless of where they are. Like, that would be a dope ass ritual. But it would deserve to be a ritual, not just a teleportation spell, right? Because that breaks all of the concepts of most teleportation, because you have to know where you're going and all of that. But that's what I mean by like, I think of like the Dresden Files and the curses that they do. There was what was it? It was like book 4 or 5 or which book? It was the book where they were doing like the actors, and the actors were in trouble from the guy with the eye, the crazy eye dude. He had like the cursed eye where he could look at you and curse him. Yes, that's the one. I said actors, but you know what I'm talking about, Big Dungeon. I got you. You got me. Thank you. But yeah, so you know what I'm talking about, right? Like, but that was that whole thing. Remember, he could feel the energy because like it was a big deal. It wasn't just like he was just spouting off these tiny little spells. It was that big like it was a ritual that he was doing to shove that much negative energy, that curse energy towards someone, because the curse wasn't like I loved it because it was almost like Death Note-y, right? That curse wasn't this person's going to die in like this specific way. It was like the curse had to figure out how the world was going to, collapse on it. And it was going to figure it out, right? Depending upon like how they set it out on the person. So that's what I'm talking about is like, I want to see that, we have, I think there is just a basic curse spell, but that doesn't do it justice. I want like a ritual that's like a full on, this energy is going to go out in the universe and find that individual at some point and fuck their world up. Like I would love to see that kind of separation, you know what I mean? And I think it would be worthwhile because if you make these spells that aren't just game changing, but game inducing, meaning that they are not only intended to drastically change things, but they're intended to be used by both player and DM, you know, to fuel a plot point or to give people, like, let's say they're in between two, you know, major like campaign sessions and the DM doesn't know what to do. So you throw out one of these, you know, these rituals that you have to go get the stuff for, right? And the ritual will give everybody a benefit for something. Like, you know, they can be permanent benefits, they could be short term. But yeah, I was really disappointed when I was so excited all week. I was like, oh, ritual casting, this is going to be such a cool history. And then, yeah, I just found out that it's basically just been that. It's just been just for giving you free spells. And while I don't disagree with that, I'm not saying that being able to have a bunch of spells, you know, not cost you. I think that's a valid feature. I just don't think that it's I just think that the idea of rituals I think holds a lot more to it than just that, and so I think it was a waste. I think it was a waste to throw that feature onto rituals. I think that feature should have been I don't even know. I'm trying to think of, like, I wish Kage was here because we'd probably be coming up with better names for it. But I feel like that should have just have been a different feat. I think we should have just called that something different, and rituals should have been recognized as much larger foundations of magic. And I think that way we could have just had a much more unique perspective of types of spells, right? Again, not just super powerful spells, but spells that actually like would change the way that the players would actually approach the game itself. So yeah, I think, let's see, do I have anything else? No, that was pretty much it. That's all I had. Like I said, it was going to be a very brief history. There was not a lot going on with ritual casting, but I think we covered a lot. I think we got to a lot of good points. I think, yeah, I think what the idea that they're trying to do with it, I think is valid. I think what they've accomplished with it, I think is in the right direction for what Wizards deserve. But I think the implementation could have been better. I mean, first off, I think in general, the way they went about it is almost a little bit too watered down. So regardless of what we call, regardless if we call ritual casting, regardless if we call it, you know, like down casting, I don't care what you want to call it. Basically, the idea of being able to cast certain types of magic without burning a spell slot, I think is fantastic. I think that there should have been more than just time. You know what I mean? I think that just simply burning more in-game time to not burn a spell slot, I think A, doesn't make any sense, and B, I think with the standard way that I've seen it played, I don't believe that that's a justifiable exchange of more of my time for you know, me being able to do a spell for free later. Like, I just don't know if that's an exchange that I'm comfortable with. I would like to see something more, whether it's, you know, like a cost value. I mean, again, most of these spells don't cost anything. So, you know, maybe being able to, I don't know, because I mean, like if it doesn't already, like, you know, consuming, you know, the material component could be an interesting aspect, but I don't know. It just saying that I spent 10 extra minutes on a spell and that therefore it's like I didn't cast it at all. I just don't understand how that would logically work in my, you know, for the way that magic works in my head. So that's where I draw my first line with it. So I think that, yeah, they could have just done more in terms of make it a better exchange. And I just think that they could have titled it something different. Personally, because I think that ritual, the term ritual could have been better used. I think we could have turned that into its own category of spells. And man, like, again, not just its own category of spells, but then each subset of magic. You know, you could have had cleric rituals and druid rituals and wizard rituals. Like, each class could have had their own new subset of types of magic that are in and of itself as rituals. Things that take a lot longer, but are unique to each of those classics, right? Like only druids would be able to create like a shelter, like the grove, right? Like a druid's grove would only be a ritual that they could cast, right? So the other ones wouldn't really have rituals that gave them shelter in a similar way, but they would also have ones that the druids wouldn't access to. So being able to also see a new class of spell be created that are specific to each of those classes, I think would be awesome too. Being able to expand what we think each of those classes should do uniquely aside from the others. I think that's another thing that we could, Kage and I have talked about that before, about just making some more fine-tuned abilities that really highlight what's different about them as spellcasters and magic classes. Warlocks could have some interesting ones with their patrons. Exactly, right? Like simply just having the ability to, just like open communications, like have a ritual that lets you open communications. I mean, can you imagine a ritual that requires, so you can have rituals have like a level minimum, right? So you can have it where it's like, I guess like a level 9 ritual. So it has to be, you have to be able to cast level 9 spells first before you cast this ritual, right? And how amazing would it be to where it's like you have the one ritual where you can like commune with your deity, but imagine like a 9th level ritual that lets you summon your patron as a warlock. Like you're in the middle of battle, it's the BBEG fight, you're almost dead, your party's almost dead, and you're or not I'm sorry, not because this is a ritual. So it wouldn't be like during the fight, but before the BBEG fight, if you wanted to really turn the tides, being able to like prep before a BBEG fight and like summon your deity or summon your patron and either get like some sort of special buff or even just have them just there as an intimidation factor before the fight, that would be really interesting. I'm curious, what else could you do with warlock like rituals? Oh man, can you imagine a warlock ritual of Find Familiar where it's like essentially you're requesting your patron send you a familiar? So you have like the Find Familiar normal spell that you could cast, but imagine a warlock having a patron familiar where you do this ritual and wherever from whatever plane your patron's from, they send you a familiar from that plane of existence. That would be absolutely phenomenal. I would like to see something like that, because you could have the same thing with clerics, where you could have like a ritual called divine intervention, right? Like you could have a legit divine intervention ritual where it's you trying to basically ask your deity to come through. Oh, that would be so interesting. What's going on, Freeman? Nice to see you here. Did you know that the races were the classes in? Yeah, I do remember that. There wasn't a whole lot of uniqueness back in the day. They were pretty much like trying to be very bare bones about it. Let's see, now I'm thinking about adding special rituals for spellcasters, make them adventures, quests to get the components. See, exactly, that's what I'm saying, right? Like, and that would be so fun to actually have a by the book mechanic for that, where it's like, hey, here's some really cool spells your players can choose from, but the optional rule is that you can make the components for them aspects of the campaign, right? Like that would be the optional rule set that you can do to even further the collaboration. Have I ever found the equipment degradation rules? Yes. I typically don't use those in the standard way. One, because I didn't like keeping track of it that in a more consistent rate. But what I do is I do have a level of degradation. Essentially, what I like to do is I treat it just like encumbrance. For the most part, I let people get away with it as long as it makes sense and as long as they're not, doing things like, carrying 19 different types of swords and 4 different types of armor and shit like that. Like, for the most part, I don't bother because there's some sort of explanation behind the scenes of what's going on that I'm usually okay with. But when it comes to degradation, I do hold people accountable for certain things. So typically, I do like my players to, do some levels of upkeep, maintain their weapons and things like that, just like how wizards have to, maintain their spell books. There is some level of upkeep. It's more narrative based. But what I like to do is this is what I like to do for crit rolls. Sometimes I'll do it when there's a crit roll. Sometimes I'll do it when there's just a situation where narratively decisions have either been really good or really bad. But what I'll do is I'll have the situations kind of play it out. So like, let's say if they are in combat and someone gets a crit against them, I might actually indicate that their armor's been damaged. Now, it may not be any functional damage at the time, but after having noted it, it will be a permanent fixture that unless they do anything about it, I will keep that of note. And if it happens again and then again and they've never fixed it, at that point I will start applying like penalties. So if for whatever reason in one combat their armor was damaged and then they've I know for a fact that they've never gone out of their way to fix it, and then in another combat I throw it out there again like, hey, looks like another piece of your armor's got really damaged. If they choose again to ignore it and just say yeah, whatever, it just looks cool, by that third time, I'm going to be like, okay, this crit hits you. One of your straps bursts off and your shoulder piece is now dangling. You have a -2 to hit because your armor's in the way, and you have a -2 to AC. So, like, again, it's more of one of those things. And if they're like, well, why didn't you tell me? It'd be like, I literally told you your armor's been damaged every single time. And, again, I wouldn't just say, oh, your armor's been damaged. You know what I mean? Like, my things are like, hey, that crit, as it came down, you heard something crunch. And you're pretty sure, like, there's your armor feels like it's like wobbling a little bit. It's a little bit, when you walk, you can hear it, clanking a little bit. So yeah, it's that got damaged a bit. And then like the next time it would be like, you see like a piece of leather or a piece of metal fall down, and you see a crack in your armor now. If they've ignored those kind of signs, that third time it's basically like, okay, your armor is basically useless now, and in fact, because you haven't upkept it, it's now going to cause you issue. And this goes back to some of my earlier episodes. I've actually been watching a lot of my, or rewatching for clips and shorts. I'm going through all my old episodes. And I have talked about this before too, where I like doing things that way, because instead of keeping up with some sort of chart or anything, it's more about keeping my players on their toes with what they say, the words they use, and making sure that they're interacting with everything, right? So, it keeps them aware that when I say things, they matter, right? If I tell them that their armor's been damaged, it's because I don't want to sit there and calculate it all, but it was good enough for them to know, hey, this is something we want to keep, we want to pay attention to. It's something I want you to interact with. And if they're just going to keep ignoring it, I'm just going to utilize that for, my own enjoyment. But at the same time, that's exactly how I run my games, right? Whatever they are or are not interacting with, I'm going to utilize, right? Like if I have a shady character following them and they keep ignoring all of the subtle hints that someone's following them, at the end of the day, when they don't get the surprise on the BBEG, or when the BBEG knows their weaknesses and they're like, how, you're metagaming that. It's like, no, I'm not. All of these clues, and you can ask Kage this too. Every single time they question me, like, well, that's not possible. I go, no. Do you remember all these clues? Do you remember when I said this? 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 This guy's been following you the whole time, and you guys have ignored him. And guess what? You did this at this time, you did this at this time, and you did this at this time, all of which he reported back, right? So I'll sit there and I'll justify it, but that's the idea. Is I don't sit there and give them tiny little clues, but I also don't just like flat out tell them. I give them what I think are justifiable hints that they have the choice to go and understand or see, but it's not supposed to be a punishment or a penalty for them not paying attention. It's just a way to make everyone aware that the storytelling is more than just the flavor text, right? It's a dynamic story that they're involved in, and that's the way that I like to just be more narrative about it, because this way it feels more natural when those things happen instead of more mechanical, right? Instead of it being, oh, I rolled, they rolled a nat 20 and then they rolled on a table and that table said that they destroyed my armor. Like, it feels more of that whole thing of like, oh, well, if I'm an adventurer and I repair my armor regularly, I won't have to worry about that. So even if I have players that just regularly go into town and every now and again they're like, hey, I'm just going to stop by the armor shop real quick, throw them a gold and let them inspect my armor. Be like, cool, you do that. They found a crack, but they fixed it really quick. They charge you an extra gold, right? Like, I'll throw in that little thing. mainly just because it's not a big deal. I don't want to do anything with it, or I'll just be like, okay, cool, you threw them a gold, they found nothing wrong, but they replaced a couple straps because they were getting old. Like, they weren't broken, but whatever. Like, I'll just, and they threw that in for free. It's like, I'll do that, because at least that way now we both know, hey, we don't have to worry about upkeep now, right? Same thing with encumbrance, right? As long as they're not overdoing it, I'm not gonna have them count every little coin and every little thing. It just, as long as they're not trying to, go from one town to the next with 10,000 gold pieces and spend 10,000 each time. It's like, where's all that money? How are you carrying that? Like, I like that, because then it takes the pressure off of them to stop worrying about it, but puts it more on the narrative of what we're doing, right? I'll do things like, hey, if my players are in what is known to be like, like metal armor, right? And like, they know it. It's a very common that they're in metal armor. And for whatever reason, they're going to go somewhere where it's like really wet and everything. I will take that into account, right? If they're going to spend a long time there, they're going to start noticing that their armor is going to get louder. They're going to start noticing that it's going to get harder to move the longer they're there. And then, all it's going to take is them going somewhere, oiling up and taking care of their armor, and then it's going to go away. I like it as more of a environmental effect than I do a base mechanic. I think that's the better way to put it, is degradation. I look at, and same thing with weapons as well. I'll make crossbows start to malfunction over time, especially like if they crit fail. The string might snap on a crit fail or multiple crit fails. But otherwise, I'll just add in small little things that are similar to environmental effects, because I feel like those have a bigger impact, and those feel nicer to the players than mechanical effects where they feel like they're constantly having to work against it. The environmental effects are more they're easier to handle, because it's just like, again, it's like being ambushed or going into a town that doesn't like you because it's the enemy's town. Like, it's an aspect that feels natural coming from the game than it does something that they're actively trying to work around or work to avoid. So that's kind of the way I do it, because I don't really like the way that they've done the mechanics in the book specifically, but I appreciate the narrative that you can utilize it with, right? Like, I appreciate the idea of having to go and repair things, or make sure your items are okay, or make sure that you have, a little, like some wax and a repair kit and things like that to upkeep. Like, I like the narrative aspect. I just don't like the no pun intended, the encumbrance of having to deal with that, either on myself as a DM or putting that on my players. So hopefully that makes sense. What were you going to do? Since you said that was better than what you were going to do. I'm glad you like that idea. I've always felt that that's easier on me. It makes it to where I can make everywhere they go is more dynamic. If they're going to be in a hot, dry place, if they're going to be in a wet place, if they're going to be cold places, these are things where, it makes sense to ask myself, like, how would this affect what they're wearing, right? Like, how would it truly actually affect it? And if it's negligible, then I just ignore it. But if it's something that makes sense to me, where, again, if they're in a wet climate because they're on the coast or whatever, and it's foggy and it's always wet, if they're there for a long period of time, it makes sense that their armor is going to get a little bit loud. But that sounds better than just saying, hey, your armor's starting to rust. Like, you have X amount of time before it stops. Like, I don't think anyone wants to think of it that way. I think you would think of it like, an adventure in the moment, right? You're coming to a new place, you're adventuring for a while, you're doing your normal thing, and then suddenly, that's getting a little loud. I'm not going to be able to sneak around very much if I don't take care of that. It's something that I think feels natural, right? It's like, that's, unless you are well traveled and for a fact, hey guys, we're going to this place, our armor is going to start to degrade. Unless you've known that, I kind of like the idea that it's just going to start happening, and then you're going to have to go, oh, that's a new problem. And I think players respond to that a little bit better, at least in my experience. So you were going to make armor break down slowly every fight. That's not necessarily a bad way to do it. One way I thought about doing, if you do want to go that route, here's one way you can do it. You can essentially give armor an HP. So this is what I did. I gave armor HP based upon, it was like a calculation. It was like a base number multiplied by the armor class that it was. And the idea was I was going to take 10% of the damage the player received. 10% was going to come off the armor's HP, the armor's hit points. And basically I was going to do like a visual effects after 30 or after 50%. And then at 25% was going to be, like minor effects. And then anything below 10% was going to be like major effects. So that's how I was going to do it. Because it kind of made sense in terms of equating it to the damage. Because again, the idea of 10% of the damage that they were taking is because obviously armor's a lot more robust, but it also takes into account all the times they missed, right? Because you don't want to calculate every single swing, because you got to think when a player misses AC, it doesn't mean that they missed the character, right? They could have contacted, but it either could have glanced off, it could have just hit a good, robust piece of armor and just not made contact. Like a miss in AC does not mean a whiff of a hit, right? It just means that it hit shield. Maybe they hit sword to sword. So taking that into account, right? Like the fact that every battle the armor would degrade to some degree, I kind of just looked at it as the armor is a lot more robust. It's going to take a lot longer. So 10% of the damage that the player took seemed to match out okay per battle, especially when you think of like, you have like an armor that's going to give you an armor class of like 6, right? Like I'm trying to think of like off the top of my head what armor classes are going to be. Because, if you have something and you do like a multiplier of of hit points of base 10, and then you take the armor class of the item and then multiply that by 10, that's a lot of hit points, right? But depending, the higher the level of the player, the more damage they're going to take, which means the more they're going to be relying on their armor, which means the faster it's going to degrade. So it also degrades faster over time the stronger they get, because that means the more damage they're going to take. And I also liked it because it represented the different types of fighters. If you have a tank, they're going to be the tank. They're going to be the one trying to take all of the damage, so their armor is obviously going to go a lot faster. And then, of course, players with lesser health will also lose armor less, right? Because they're supposedly doing it. So that's the way that I thought about doing it a while back. It's just, it gets clunky. It gets to be a lot of math. But if you are interested, that was just one option. You can do percentage of armor too. Yeah, exactly. Like any sort of percentage armor. And then, every successful hit or something like that. 100% to 0.01% of damage to player. Yeah, exactly. There's so many different ways that you can break down degradation, but just because, for me, again, like I said, I like to have it as part of the narrative and as part of the environment. So I just throw it in when it makes sense, but I totally understand having that more realistic mechanic of degradation that it does add a unique tacticalness to the game, especially if you have players who are more analytical. So they like to, be the pen and paper players. They like to get into the weeds of what's going on with their character and what they're wearing and all of that stuff, right? The games, I look at it as like, the people who are drawn to games like Cyberpunk, right? Where you're in your character a lot, doing all of the tweaking. Those are kind of the things that I would, that I think a lot of those kind of players would really appreciate doing. But yeah, excellent. That was that. Thank you. That's a lot of good insight, good content, good questions as well. But yeah, with that, I'm actually really surprised. I got to thank you so much. You guys helped me bring it all the way to the 2-hour mark. I was actually really worried that I wasn't going to make 2 hours with ritual casting, just because it wasn't a big history. I didn't have Kage here to feed off of with ideas, but I think we covered everything that we needed to. I think I was able to express my ideas about ritual casting. It just took me a while to properly phrase my mindset on it. You did great. Thanks, honestly. You got a lot out of it. Well, awesome, Big Dungeon. I am so happy that you did. I really do also hope that your DMing and your games are doing great. Oh, hello. Hang on a second. What happened there? All of a sudden, my screen changed. But yeah, I hope that your streams are doing well. I haven't had a chance myself to catch you, but I do know that because you stream just about the same time that I do. So, wait, what is going on here? Hang on a second. There we go. I don't know what was going on with my screen. But yeah, so I'm really happy that we were able to get to the 2 hour mark. It's always kind of like where I feel comfortable, at least like getting to the bare minimum. But yeah, thank you all for joining me for the history of ritual casting. I think we got a lot of good ideas out. I'm really going to be excited. Starting later this month, I'm going to be doing a lot of, I'm going to be learning Adobe Premiere. I'm going to be trying to do some YouTube content. So I'm just really looking forward to these newer episodes that we're doing things like this. I'm looking forward to finally catching up and getting these episodes edited, because I think that we had a lot of good conversations. I think there's going to be a lot of good little tidbits I'm going to be able to snag out for shorts, maybe a couple of small little episodes, and then of course just the regular edited. They are doing good. Had to take a week off from prep. Luckily, we don't have a game this week. So I have another week. Oh, that's very nice. Yeah. Anytime you get that little like a breather room in between those, those long stretches of games, it's always nice to kind of catch up. I tell my players every couple months I have to take some time off to do basically what I have to do, like the butterfly. The butterfly effect, where I basically have to take everything that they've done the last couple months and I just have to sit on it and just let it like propagate through High Point and just figure out, okay, what does this mean now? Because it's like there's so many things that have been static for so long that every now and again I just have to take a step back. I think the longest one I ever took was like a year. I had to there's so much had happened. I had to take a step back, and it took me like a year to just figure it all out. But yeah, that's just the joys of of running your own thing and having your own world. But that's what I like about it. I'm always excited to see what's gonna happen next. I find it more fun to see how my world's going to react to my players than see what they're going to react to what I do, or see to react to what I make, because we've talked about this before. DMs, we look at DMs as another player. They just have a different job, right? They have a different aspect, but they're playing the game just as much. And I don't like looking at it as I created this, so what are you going to do with it? I always like to create something to see not just what the players are going to do, but then what is my world going to do in response to it, right? Like that's that back and forth I always look forward to. So yeah, when you can get those times to just let it all like simmer, come back to fruition, and then jump right back into those gaming sessions with some new ideas, that's always a fun and exciting thing. That's why we're excited to also get gaming on stream as well. We are working really hard right now. We're making our but we're making a bunch of steps towards being able to bring High Point onto stream. We just haven't figured out exactly all of the tweaks that we want to do just yet, but keep in mind, we will be doing that in the near future. But until then, we were just going to continue with our regularly scheduled programming. So if you guys liked what you saw, you guys can join us again on Monday, where we will continue with our homebrew submissions, where we will review homebrew items that have been submitted by the community. And then, of course, on Fridays, where we do our deeper discussions, where we look at the history of certain topics, or we'll deep dive into certain areas. Next week, you can join us on Friday for deeper discussions, where we'll be talking about the history of the spell Simulacrum. This has gone through several different changes throughout the editions, so it's going to be very fascinating to see Kage's insight, as well as my own, on the many editions that have happened throughout Simulacrum and all of the changes, what they meant, what it was always intended for. I don't know what the current item is on Monday off the top of my head. That's usually Kage's business. But if you guys are interested in that, you can see, you can get a sneak peek at next week's item if you want to join the Discord. So I'm going to throw that link in the chat right now. If you want to join our community, you can just join, chat with us off stream. You can submit ideas for us to talk to, or to talk about on stream, or questions you want us to answer. And you can even submit your home brews for us to review on Mondays. Also, if you liked what you saw here today and you missed anything, or if you want to see any of my other live streams, you can catch that all on YouTube. We do have a VODs channel, so I will pop that into the chat as well. Otherwise, that's going to be us for this week. Thank you all for joining me today. Cosmic, I saw you there at the very beginning. Hope you have had a fantastic week. I'll get to your question in the Discord here this weekend. Angry Meatball and Big Dungeon Energy, thank you so much for joining and keeping me company. Freeman, thank you again for all of the great ideas and the feedback. It's great when you guys keep me company and just help talk to me. It's always fantastic to see you guys here. We are also on the road to affiliate. We are 2 followers away. I think you guys are pretty much nailing the 3 viewers a stream, though. I think we're pretty much going to get there after this stream, so that's fantastic to see. And yeah, just a lot is coming down the line. We've got the name change that we recently just did, so we are now officially fully branded as Misfit Gamer Studios across all platforms. We have YouTube content coming very, very soon. This month, I'm going to start teaching myself video editing. Once we hit affiliate, we have a couple other surprises right around the corner. So stay tuned for that. Big moves. Let's see. We've been doing this for 14 months now, so we're hoping big moves. Let's go. But yes, you know what? You guys have been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys had a fantastic weekend. I hope you have a great weekend ahead of you. That's going to be all from Misfit Gamer Studios for this week. Thank you guys so much. Have a great weekend. Cheers.